Okay,
hello everyone. Welcome to LSE and welcome to European Institute. It's one of the LSE departments that's putting on this event. My name is Denisa Kostovichova and I'm a professor of global politics at the European Institute. And it is my great pleasure today to welcome our speaker, Dr. Elke Evrard. Elke is coming to us from the University of Ghent. She's a postdoctoral researcher at the Human Rights Center of the Faculty of Law and Criminology there. And she is also a member of the Justice Visions Research Project and Program, which is funded by European Research Council. And I'm really pleased to be able to welcome Elke on behalf of our ERC-funded research program, Justice Interactions and Peace Building, that I'm directing here at the LSE. So it's really wonderful to have these connections between these different research programs that deal with issues of justice for gross human rights violations. So specifically, Elke is working on victim participation, public outreach, reparations, and memory making in transitional justice contexts and post-conflict settings, and contributing to an emerging agenda in research on transitional justice that looks at how victims can meaningfully participate in these processes. So we know from the scholarship and from practice that to address atrocities and human rights violations and to design approaches that address victims' needs, these cannot be done without understanding really well what the victims' needs are in the first instance. However, we also know from research that victims' needs are not addressed, that they're often figuring in these processes as almost a window dressing, or that these processes end up traumatizing victims rather than helping them heal. So I'm delighted that Elke will talk about her research, which is, as I said, on the cutting edge of the field and rethinking these processes. And I'm also very happy that we've been able to put on this event as a part of our Beyond Eurocentrism program at the European Institute, which is a program of events which takes Europe in a global context and sort of engages with ideas from a critical perspective. So, Elke, thank you very much, and let's give Elke a warm LSE welcome. So, Elke will speak for half an hour, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers.
Hello to everyone. I just want to thank Denisa, Eva, Charlotte, and everyone who helped set up this lovely event today. As Denisa mentioned, I'm distinct from Ghent University in Belgium, where I'm a postdoctoral researcher with the Justice Visions team. And so Justice Visions is a larger project. It involves several researchers who are looking at transitional justice processes in different countries across the world. And so for those who might not be super familiar with that terminology, transitional justice means all the legal, but also the non-legal, political, social processes and mechanisms that are typically put into place to address the legacies of violence and human rights violations in context of conflict, in the context of authoritarianism, or, for example, addressing historical injustices. And they encompass typically 5 different pillars: criminal accountability processes, so holding perpetrators of human rights violations accountable, truth mechanisms like truth commissions, for example, looking to uncover the facts and the patterns of the violence that happens. Reparations, which will be important for today's lecture, which seek to redress victims of human rights violations in different ways. There's also memory processes, trying to memorialize and educate broader society about what happens in order to ensure non-recurrence, and different kinds of guarantees of non-recurrence. And that's typically looking at different kinds of reform in law, in police, in army, but also in education. And so together, these mechanisms make up a sort of transitional justice toolkit, or a set of mechanisms that are often applied in different countries across the world. In our research, or what I want to talk about today, is more specifically about the context in Guatemala. And so, as you might or might not know, Guatemala endured a very violent internal armed conflict that lasted 36 years, from the 60s until 1996. And this was a war that was fought between the government and several leftist guerrilla groups. And as part of its counterinsurgency tactics, the Guatemalan state acted with massive violence, with political repression, disappearings, killings in urban areas, but also, and disproportionately so, in the highlands of the country against indigenous communities. And this happened because Maya indigenous communities, which form a very large part, nearly half, even slightly more than half of the Guatemalan population, they were often seen as being complicit with the guerrilla, as being as aiding and abetting, let's say, the guerrilla forces. And this led, in several cases, in nearly 600 cases, to mass killings, where entire communities or villages were destroyed and its inhabitants killed. And so one of my colleagues conducted research in this particular community. So what you can see here is the Cocop community. It's a small community in the Ixil region of Guatemala. So you can sort of see there the Ixil triangle. The Ixil are a subgroup of Maya indigenous peoples, and this community was one of the first ones to endure a massacre. So over 80 of its inhabitants were killed, the village was destroyed, everyone was displaced. And many years later, when the violence finally started to dissipate, the people returned and tried to rebuild their community. And part of that rebuilding meant claiming reparations. And so the people in this village have, for 30 years now almost, been claiming truth, redress, memory, and they did that in various spaces. So they've looked at the National Reparations Program and formed claims for both individual and community reparations. They've also gone to the Inter-American Court because the state hasn't come forth with repair. So they've put that in files to the Inter-American Court. They've also mobilized, they've also organized memory events. So in many, many ways, they're trying to sort of actively pursue different kinds of justice measures for what happened in their community. Now, when my colleague was there, one of the things that she noticed was how important it was for the community that their stories about what happened, about the injustices, but also their claims for justice, for repair, were heard. And so they asked my colleague, for example, to facilitate a number of radio shows where they could talk on the radio and have their story be broadcast more broadly. They also asked her with support in trying to set up a museum for memory and different kinds of memory initiatives within the community. So the idea was that they wanted to also mobilize, let's say, broader Guatemalan society to educate, to raise awareness, and to raise support for their claims. And that particular topic that I want to talk more about today, this idea of the hearability of claims for redress and repair. This is very important because in the Guatemalan context, there is still a lot of, let's say, silence. There is a sort of push by economic and military and political elites, conservative elites who've largely maintained power since the conflict, to move on, to justify the violence that happened, to suppress different justice processes, and they very actively do so in different kinds of media and, of course, through political strategies. And so really the claims that survive as a foregrounding are in face of a sort of dominant discourse of forgetting, moving on, forgiving. And so the people in Guatemala, non-victimized groups, they come into contact, let's say, with these almost memory battles, with this politics of memory, where you have very different sorts of narratives about what happened, what are the consequences, and what now circulate within society. So I talked about most of these aspects already, but this is just a little broader explanation about the conflict and about the reparation program. So as I mentioned, during the internal armed conflict, massive and systematic human rights violations, mainly against the Maya indigenous peoples. In 1996, there was finally the signing of a peace agreement. And this was very important because that peace agreement also mandated these different transitional justice mechanisms that I talked about. There were 2 truth commissions, for example, one organized by the church and one organized by the state. And that was very important in sort of breaking the silence on what happened. Many people living in the capital, for example, had no idea about the things that transpired in these more remote rural communities. In 2003, finally, there was also this national reparations program set up. And this was really done in response to what I mentioned, that mobilization. It was active demands from different communities, from victim collectives, human rights defenders, different types of human rights organizations, women's groups, and so on, who really mobilized in order to make that happen. And so that reparations program, well, on paper at least, was actually quite innovative, in the sense that it was very comprehensive. It entailed 5 measures: restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, dignification, and cultural restitution. So it means that there were both individual and collective types of repair, both monetary or financial compensation, or the returning of lands, goods, homes, and so on. But also at a collective level, for example, compensation in the sense of the provision of basic services, building a school, providing healthcare, providing psychosocial care. And then there were also a range of more what's called symbolic measures. And that is, for example, exhumations, being able to actually properly, with the proper rites, rebury your loved ones. So different kinds of forms of repair, individual, collective, material and symbolic. On paper, that was very much in line with sort of the kind of comprehensive and integral understanding of reparations that's often pushed, both in jurisprudence but also in the literature. Now in reality, not much came of this. Why? Because successive governments have actually tried to quite actively dismantle these programs or to undermine these programs by under-budgeting them, staff cuts in the organizations that were supposed to manage these processes, and so on. And this was, of course, a political move. And what we saw was that in 2023, so just last year, after 20 years, this program was ended. Well, in reality, a lot of communities and a lot of people have not seen much. And the community that I just showed, the Kokop community, there are a few sort of houses, shells of houses that were built but never finished. The monetary reparations haven't come through, and these more collective forms of repair, like in healthcare and so on, never really materialized. And so the communities keep on pushing, they keep on mobilizing, they keep on with that trajectories looking for redress, and they do that in a quite hostile context where we see democratic backsliding in Guatemala, denial, stigmatization of victims, and so on. Now, importantly, and I don't know if any of you know this, last year in December, a new president was elected. And this was quite surprising because it was actually a moderate candidate, a bit of an outsider, and he won despite a lot of resistance from political elites, attempts to criminalize him, to push him out of the elections, and so on. And that's important because this is actually a person with a human rights background who's quite supportive of transitional justice. So that might open new possibilities. Now, I've been talking a lot about the international human rights framework, about victim mobilization, and about the state and political will or lack of political will on behalf of the state. And these are also typically sort of the dynamics that are being studied when it comes to reparations and the success factors for reparations or the determinants of how repair can or cannot be implemented. But something else that isn't really studied enough or taken into account enough is this idea of, okay, but what of the rest of society? What is the role of public opinion? And what's the role or potential role of support by non-victimized groups in Guatemalan society? This is important because they have the potential to advance or hinder reparations, both the actual implementation of these reparations, but also their broader objectives. So looking backwards, we often say that reparations have a backwards and forward-looking role. And looking backwards, of course, they're meant to acknowledge and compensate the harm by actually coming forward with tangible repair measures. But looking forward, they're very important in the sense that they are also, they're supposed to re-include victimized peoples as rights holders and citizens in society. They're supposed to signal the fact that state and society acknowledge what happened and that they're willing to put resources into the plight of these communities in order to actually recognize their status as rights holders and citizens. Now, we hypothesized, or we thought that these memory battles, these different narratives that circulate within Guatemalan society probably have a pretty big impact on the extent to which people do or do not develop what we call solidary support for reparations. And on that picture, you can see one of those examples of those memory battles taking place in the public domain. This is just a wall on a street in Guatemalan City that we passed by as we were going to a restaurant to eat something. And you can see that there someone, a victim or an ally or a media person or someone else put up these posters with the faces of disappeared people who've never been found and put them up in a very sort of public place in Guatemala City to denounce the fact that these injustices are still ongoing and haven't been repaired. But there's also, of course, talk in the space of media and definitely also in social media where you have different groups sort of engaged in discursive battles almost about, was there a genocide in Guatemala? No, there was not. Are these real victims or aren't they? Should we be repairing? No, we shouldn't. So these very active battles going on in the public space. This is a bit technical, but in order to study these dynamics, we designed a three-group post-test only survey-embedded online experiment. So it means a survey in which an experimental design was embedded. And we had three groups of respondents. And so one of these groups read a text about reparations and the situation in Guatemala that was very much informed by the dominant narrative of conservative elites, which focused on, well, these things happened, right? This violence happened. It was terrible, but it's also time to move on. This was a long time ago. What we need is unity and progress in order for our country to thrive. And this talk of reparations actually is quite divisive because it reinforces ethnic lines, it distracts us from actually tackling corruption, criminality in current society, and it's also very burdensome economically for our state. Another group of respondents read what we call the counter-narrative. So this is inspired by the sort of stories in the narrative that victims try to bring into the public space. And they stress that, well, actually, it might be a long time ago, but the harm continues. The consequences of the harm continue. And also embedded in a very long historical and structural history of violence against Maya people. So they place the conflict and the genocidal acts that happened against the communities within a very long history of colonial violence against these communities. They say it is absolutely crucial to acknowledge and to repair, and that integral reparations are necessary to actually foster peace and social cohesion. So these are kind of the two, let's say, opposing narratives that circulate in society. We had a third group, a control condition. Why? Because we didn't do a pre and post test. So in an experimental design, ideally, you usually measure at 2 points in time, before you do a treatment and afterwards. But sometimes, as we see here, it might not be very feasible to do so. So we have a control group who read nothing. So we just told them we're going to ask you some questions about a societal topic, and we're going to ask you to answer some questions about that. And the control group actually allows us to have a sort of benchmark to compare what happens with these two other treatment groups. So what was our idea, or what was the hypothesis? The idea was that reading that counter-narrative that was inspired by stories of victims would actually increase the perceptions of victims' ongoing suffering, and therefore present reparations as being legitimate and necessary. And it would also increase perceptions of reparations' potential to contribute to peace, meaning that they would also be seen as impactful, necessary. And that together, those perceptions would increase political solidarity with victims demanding reparations, and in turn, actual support for their claims. And the dominant narrative was thought to do the reverse, so lower perceptions of victims' ongoing suffering, and lower the idea that reparations can contribute to peace, lower political solidarity, lower support for repair. And of course, this was compared to the control. What did we actually see in the findings of that experiment? Well, actually, now maybe I'll show it on this slide again. We actually saw that this entire proportion of our hypothesis was correct. So yes, indeed, these perceptions are very important predictors of solidarity and of support. However, our narratives, our treatments, didn't really do what we thought it would do. So the counter-narrative didn't just increase these perceptions, and the dominant narrative didn't just decrease those perceptions. What actually happened was that based on person's political leaning, based on their levels of knowledge about the debate, and based on several sort of personal beliefs about rights and justice, people responded very differently to these narratives. And so what you could see, for example, show it on this slide, is that if you look here, for example, this is what people believe in terms of can reparations contribute to peace. We actually saw that in general, left-leaning people have a higher belief in reparations contribution to peace compared to center and right. That's perfectly within what we would expect. However, both reading the counter-narrative and the dominant narrative makes left-leaning people, for example, a lot less optimistic about reparations. So what happens there, for example, is that when people read about such vast ongoing suffering, in combination with having low institutional trust in the government, left-leaning people in particular became quite pessimistic about the fact that reparations are actually going to change something and are going to contribute to peace. So that was not in line necessarily with what we were expecting. On the other hand, we did see that with more right-leaning people, we had the effects that we thought that we would reach, that reading a dominant narrative makes them even more pessimistic about contributions to peace, and the counter-narrative here a little bit more compared to the control. So depending on a range of what we call intrapersonal beliefs and worldviews, people responded very differently to the text that we were showing them. In addition, you also saw that many of them, they had encountered these narratives before. They had already formed quite stable and also very diverse opinions about the conflict, and especially about the plight of indigenous peoples. So it was actually quite difficult in this experimental context to prime them, as we say, to expose them to new information that they supposedly do not know yet. So all of this made for what we call a null measurement. And a null measurement means that you do not measure the anticipated effect. We did not see that this first part of that diagram did not actually appear in our results. What we did see, you can see it here. What you can see is that, yes, continued suffering and contribution to peace are very clear predictors of support for reparations and political solidarity. Meaning, it's very important to understand why or how do people come to believe that victims are still suffering, and why and how do they come to believe that reparations can actually contribute to peace. We had a number of open-ended questions in our survey as well that asked them, after using these scales, ask them, can you explain your answer? Why do you say this? Why do you believe this? And there we applied a thematic analysis. And we actually saw that there were three very often recurring, let's call them frames, interpretive frames or themes, that kind of made people be more, or let's say less supportive of reparations. And so those three frames were a rights and justice team, a healing and reconciliation team, and an economic progress and development team. And I have some quotes here to make it a bit more expressive, or to kind of show you a little bit more what people said and thought as they were completing that survey. So you had, these are placed actually in order of being more supportive of reparations to less supportive of reparations. You can see that all of these people, they mobilized a sort of rights and justice frame. And for those with a high support for repair, they really said that, well, the state has an obligation to repair. The state has an obligation to realize the rights of these people, and these rights were unjustly violated. And so victims deserve redress. It is what is fair, it is what is just. They mobilize human rights, morality, and other reasons why they believe that repair should happen. And they also say that this is a sort of precondition to having social justice in their country. However, and this quote, for example, shows that, I already talked about the fact that institutional trust, so trust in the state, trust in the judiciary, is quite low amongst many people in Guatemala because of corruption, because of a failure to fulfill the peace agreements. And so being confronted with these narratives of survivors also made some of them very, let's say, pessimistic in a sense. So they say, well, we don't just need reparations, we need very far-reaching structural reforms in this country. We need a complete transformation of our social and economic and political system. And it makes them ambivalent about whether repair is going to make a change. And of course, at the more extreme end, you can see people who actually turn around the discourse and they say, well, these people who are claiming reparations don't have a right to them. They are not legitimate claimants. Why? Well, a lot of time has passed. These people have died. They've moved to other countries. The people who are now claiming reparations, they didn't experience the violence firsthand. They just want money. They will keep asking more, and so on. So they sort of turn around the rights and justice discourse to say, well, it's not just and it's not fair that we should be paying reparations to these claimants. A second theme focuses much more on healing and reconciliation. And these are respondents who focus very much on the fact that the conflict has led to a lot of psychological, social, emotional wounds and trauma at the individual level, but also for communities. And so they believe, well, if they're supportive of reparations, they say reparations can help. They can help heal individual people, communities, and even society. For example, because they can support exhumations, they can support cultural dignification and rebuilding indigenous culture, which was attempted to be, destroyed during the conflict. They can help communities heal. They can provide, for example, psychosocial care to older people who are still carrying trauma, and so on. But you can also see here that that team is also mobilized in different ways. So, for example, that second quote, it's about societal healing and reconciliation, and it says, if we give these communities reparations, they will feel included in a state that has always excluded them, and this will build bridges between people and between communities. However, there's also people who say, well, these losses, these extreme losses, losing an entire family, losing your land, your home, losing everything, that is so fast, it affects us to such an extent that you cannot repair this. And in Indigenous Maya culture, there is also this notion of a final loss, a loss that cannot be repaired. So that, of course, makes people more pessimistic about reparations and what they can do. And here, at the more extreme end of non-supportive people, you see, for example, people who say, well, I don't see how giving someone money or land is supposed to compensate for a human life. This is also a bit disregarding Maya indigenous culture, where there's a much stronger connection between material and spiritual beliefs, and where, for example, land and even crops like corn, for example, have a deep spiritual value to the community. So restituting these is also about cultural and spiritual healing, but this is not something that most respondents picked up on. At the most extreme end, you can see that people echo some of that narrative in the public domain, where they say, well, this is very divisive. You're giving resources to a part of the population and not others. this will continue to cause tensions. And this person even said, it's going to end up fueling another war very soon. So this theme is also used to say no to reparations. Now, lastly, we saw there was quite a lot of focus on development and economic progress. And this is, of course, acknowledging that many of the communities that I've been talking about, they continue to live in extreme poverty. The first picture that I showed of the Kokok community, well, some of these houses have one light bulb. They have, well, some of them have water, others have not. The houses do not have flooring. So, I mean, people are still living in very precarious circumstances, and the state has basically not addressed this at all. And so some people say, well, reparations can, especially these collective type of reparations like healthcare facilities, access to education, and so on, these can help the development of these communities. So yes, repair can help with development, and development can lead to peace, basically. Others say, well, some forms of repair. And so they feel that survivors should not be receiving individual monetary compensation, for example. And this is sometimes a bit stereotypical or paternalistic, the idea that people wouldn't be able to sort of individually manage monetary funds that they are given. And so there's a lot of support for saying, well, we need employment, we need education, we need health, more than, let's say, individual monetary compensation. And then here you can see that there's this very strong and recurring discourse about you can give reparations, but it will just make people dependent. So instead of being emancipatory, it makes them dependent on the state, they put out their hands. So there is a lot of racism, stigmatization, often of indigenous communities as being beggars, as being dependent upon the state. And at its most extreme form, people say, well, they're just discontent. So it's not really fair. And here you can see that link to the fairness again. It's not fair that the rest of the society needs to pay. And this person even said, the people who provoked the internal war. So you can see that there's an extreme polarization, let's say, between some of these respondents and answers. What's interesting about this to us was that it's not a binary discourse. So we were looking at a dominant narrative and a counter. You can actually see that different people mobilize different aspects of these these discourses in their answers, and that often has been formed by the way that they interpret discourses in the public space according to their own beliefs, what they know, and the extent to which they've read and seen these narratives before. And so based on all of these insights, I'm now working on a new project proposal that wants to take this research a little step further and look more at how does the social legal context, meaning, sort of public space that I've been talking about, media, these narratives, but also victims' activism, also state policies, how do they interact with people's personal beliefs on right and identity to shape these perceptions of suffering that is or isn't ongoing, these perceptions of do reparations actually have a beneficial societal impact or not, and so on. And I'll do that in countries with different harm contexts, different out-group boundaries, and different levels of reparatory action, including in Europe. So right now, I'm probably looking at doing that research in the context of Canada with reparations for the Indian school system, and in Spain in the context of the post-Franco environment where people also haven't received repair yet. So I'll be using some of the insights from this study to try and build more comprehensive theory that can help us understand why and how and under what conditions non-victimized groups do or do not develop support for reparation.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That was very rich and also very clear the way you presented. Maybe we can sit down and have a bit of a question and answer session to delve a bit deeper into some aspects of your presentation. So can I please sort of collect questions? Are there any questions from the audience? And when you ask questions, please introduce yourself first. Thank you.
My name is Bojana. I come from Montenegro. I'm visiting PhD student from the Faculty of University of Belgrade, Faculty of Law. And thank you so much for your presentation. It was really amazing. There's one aspect that you mentioned, and it really kind of opened up some questions for me. So you said that actually, like those people are not tabula rasa, so they know something. Like they are previously informed about the situation, or they have already some narratives. And so what are actually the sources of information that are, in your opinion, the most impactful? Is that formal education system? Is that media, civil society? Like to what extent it's active, how much it promotes specific narratives? This is the first thing. And also the second thing was about the group itself. So could you maybe distinguish between some maybe age groups? So those who were to some extent involved, or they were bystanders, and those who were born after, because we saw that the agreement was signed back in 1996. So yeah, are there any differences there?
Right, yeah, thank you so much for that question. From what we could gather, and of course from our broader knowledge of the context, some of the most important factors through which people have become socialized in these sort of narratives, both about the war, but also more generally about the position of indigenous peoples in Guatemalan society, was media, education, family, even the location in the country, like how far were they removed from the places where violence occurred. In terms of education, it's relevant to mention that in Guatemala, there's actually only one public university. The rest of the universities are private, and there's a clear, let's say, political divide as well between that. We first wanted to do our survey with student population, which is a typical thing to do. Often experiments are run with a student population. And we couldn't do that because the public university in Guatemala has such a clear, let's say, political, more left-leaning view on the conflict that we knew that the students that we would be talking to would not be representative at all for the general population. So definitely education, also family backgrounds. Age plays a role. With younger people tend generally to be more supportive. However, that effect is disappears if you bring the variables into play. So we ran a regression analysis also looking at all of these demographic factors, but none of these remained significant once we inserted political leaning and perceptions of ongoing suffering and perceptions of reparations contribution to peace in that regression. Then you could see that that actually completely mediated the effect of other social demographics.
Thank you. Yeah, we have a question there.
So this is more just like a contextual question. You mentioned the...
Introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry. My name is Adam. I'm a master's student in the philosophy department. You mentioned the two sort of truth-telling, truth commission processes. One was, you said one was government, one was church. And then you also mentioned the National Reparations Program. The government programs, were those parliamentary initiatives, or were those like government departmental initiatives? And then sort of what was the like political context and support for those when they were initiated? Sort of just to get a better idea of the popularity of these.
So in terms of the truth commissions, indeed, one of them was church-led. And this was because actually the church played a quite, let's say, progressive role in the Guatemalan context. And because the church actually had quite a good access to rural populations in order to gather a very large amount of testimony. So the church played quite a big role. And then I think it was only a few years later that we had the state sanctions truth commission. And this was very much under pressure of the international community. So yeah, you have to imagine that the international legal framework and the international community does exert certain pressure on countries to, at least on paper, initiate some of these initiatives. So the United Nations was heavily involved in that second truth commission. The reparations program was enacted by presidential decree. And these have to be seen in a context where you have sort of fluctuating opportunity structures. Depending on which government comes into power, there are more openings or less openings to pursue certain justice-seeking objectives. I don't know if that answers your question.
So now we'll have take a group of questions. So maybe that. Then we have the next one is here, and the one at the back. So let's do 3 questions.
Hi, I'm Lisa. I'm getting my master's in gender studies. I was wondering if you worked with Indigenous scholars to define certain terms like reparations, victimization, etc., and if you also saw difference in tendency to develop solidary support amongst different gender groups.
Hello. Yeah. Hi, my name is Silir Saliu. I'm a master's student here at LSE doing social anthropology. And my question is, from your experience, how do these policies affect general policy making and voter tendencies in the countries that you have studied? So how they affect the, let's say, the way that the people view the government?
Okay, so the debate about reparation generates deep entrenched historical perspectives and emotional responses shaped by socio-legal contexts. Different ideologies and historical narratives influence popular perception and attitudes towards reparative justice. What do you think is the best approach towards examining the intersection of socio-legal contexts and those other purposes that shape the reparation debates? Especially the ones addressing just the tension between historical accountability and contemporary public sentiment.
Okay. I didn't catch your name, so if you could please introduce yourself. Thank you.
Thomas.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. So we have 3 questions out here on gender, on voter, and how these processes interact, basically.
So in terms of gender, that's a very good question, and I did mention this, but the Guatemalan transitional justice process has been very important because it has been one of the first contexts in which gender and sexual-based violence have really sort of been put on the agenda, mainly because of sort of the bravery of a lot of women who came forward to testify. There have been a number of landmark court cases on sexual violence specifically as a weapon of war. And it was interesting that actually those perspectives were not at all visible in the official Truth Commission process, but that these were really, that this really came about because women took center stage, women decided to testify in court, for example, about their experiences, which was incredibly important because the stigma that surrounds these kinds of violences and the potential impact that they would have for women and their role in the community was vast. So this was a very important aspect of the process in Guatemala. However, also the reparations weren't necessarily gender sensitive. So in the design of the reparations, there hadn't actually been taken into account the fact that reparations can also be gender transformative, potentially, if they take into account the specific consequences of harm and of conflict for women in these communities, but that didn't really happen. In terms of linguistics and cultural sensitivity, I was mainly involved in running the survey, but my colleague Gretel, who did the actual fieldwork, is Guatemalan. She worked with a local research assistant, so a person who's actually from the Ixil region and herself from the Ixil community, who acted as an interpreter, but she also took language courses to have at least a very, let's say, basic level of understanding of certain Ixil words. And that is very important because even the word reparation in Spanish, it means something different than in English, but in Ixil, it means even still something different than it means in Spanish. And there was a lot of attention to understanding what repair meant in an indigenous context. So, and I gave a few examples of the fact that, for example, because in the cosmo-view, in the worldview of my indigenous people, in their cosmovision, they have a different, let's say, relationship both to community, but also to land, to natural resources, and so on. And that all comes into play when thinking about repair. And that's something that in the, let's say, international human rights framework, which is very Western-oriented, isn't necessarily always taken into account. So doing that kind of work and rebuilding the concepts of justice and repair from the perspective of the communities themselves, and also in their own language and with sensitivity to their cultural worldviews, is absolutely very important. Then the next question was about, voting and governmental views and whether or not this entire context has an impact on the way people vote. I would say yes and no. Yes, in the sense that as part of this broader transitional justice framework, I talked about guarantees of non-recurrence. And so I think almost a decade or more ago now, as part of that program, an initiative was launched that looked at corruption throughout different levels in the state. So these were judicial initiatives under I think the department was called CICIC, and they looked specifically at also corruption, economical harm, and so a lot of, let's say, people in the political elites, of course, came under scrutiny because of this, and this really was part of those reform guarantees of non-recurrence. But that entire, let's say, program or initiative was axed. So a few years ago, there was a huge backlash there, and that government actually sort of disbanded that again. And there's some belief that what we see now with a more moderate candidate, an outsider candidate being elected, had something to do with people resisting, because that was a very popular measure, that anti-corruption measure, and the fact that it was dismantled again is thought to have some impact in the way that people voted. So I would say yes and no to the question of whether people also actually vote in consequence or in response to the way that governments have or have not tackled transitional justice issues. And I think the last question asked also about ways of studying this, right? Like, how can we actually understand the interaction between all of these very complex dynamics? In the end, an experimental design is not the only, maybe not even the right way to study this in absence of doing more qualitative research. So going forward, what I want to do is really incorporate both a macro level view. So with macro, we mean how can we understand dynamics that happen at the level of the state, with a macro, which is looking at individuals. And so for the new project that I'm developing, I'll both look at discourse through the lens of text mining, so using machine learning and data mining approaches to understand big amounts of text to form a good understanding of kind of the themes and tropes that circulate in a broader societal discourse, and combine that with ethnography or digital ethnography. And it means looking really in depth at certain online interactions. Like, for example, how do people respond to a media story about this topic? How do people on social media, for example, respond to different governmental actions, to events, to mobilization, and so on? For example, looking at different hashtags, looking at proponents and opponents, and then what are they saying? And then I'll combine that again with survey research, but not necessarily experimental, but more trying to use some vignettes, meaning having people look at different scenarios for repair and sort of gauging their reactions to that and what they feel about that. And also combine that with interviewing and with focus groups to understand a little bit more those personal beliefs. That's something that's very difficult to catch often in surveys or other types of methods, like what do people believe fundamentally about rights? What do they fundamentally believe about identity and group identity? And how does that connect to what they think about reparations? That's something that I'll be looking at through more individual interviews and focus groups. So we need qualitative and quantitative, right? So we need meaning and measurement, and we need multi-level, at the level of the state, at the level of the individual, and then, of often family, school, somewhere in between that, the meso level. So studying this, it requires mixed methods and multi-level type of research, and also interdisciplinary. It combines aspects from social psychology, from human rights literature, from social legal studies. So yeah, it requires a lot of components to come together into one research.
It does. Any other questions? Yes, we'll put it there.
Hi there, my name is Sana and I'm a master's student in international relations here at LSE. Thank you so much for your talk. My question is on the international community. I know you briefly touched on like regional courts perhaps. I know the whole issue of the disappeared in Latin America isn't just an issue innate to Guatemala, but also with Argentina and Chile. And so I'm just wondering, what do you think the role of the international community is, or perhaps the regional community, in reparations, and is there one at all?
Thank you so much. My name's Emmanuel, and I'm in the International Development and Humanitarian Emergencies Program. And you mentioned at the beginning kind of these military, economic, and political elites. So I was wondering broadly how these power dynamics affected your process, but also specifically when it comes to defining kind of non-victimized groups. I'm Salvadorian, so we also had a very similar conflict. So kind of the notion of, you know, there's non-victimized groups, but so many of the elites are parties to the conflict even today. So how did that also affect kind of the dominant thematics, which can also be, I think, a lot more extreme since elites are in power just, you know, farther than just unity, but still kind of this notion that the war was deserved and the counterinsurgency was deserved.
Hi, I'm Jacob. I'm a fellow at the European Institute. Thank you so much for your talk. I mean, I have a question about the kind of effects of bringing victim narratives into the public sphere and what you think that does. Because on the one hand, maybe we like to believe that, you know, it's good if stuff is not silenced and if it can be talked about. But then, I mean, you brought in one kind of perhaps unintended consequence, which I found was super interesting. This idea that it's demobilizing or demoralizing. That actually, you know, people say, "Oh, actually, this stuff is so bad. I mean, actually, you know, what can we even do with that?" And then there is also, I feel like, a large literature, maybe in anthropology, that is a bit skeptical of, you know, this kind of grounding political claims in victimhood and narratives of trauma and what that does to people to always be addressed as victims and never as full citizens, but as kind of people in need of pity and of care. So I wonder what you make of this argument and if you see some of these dangers at play in your context, in the context that you worked in. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Julia, and I'm a master's student in the International Migration and Public Policy program at the LSE. And my question was related to maybe your understanding of how timeline plays into reparatory policymaking, in that I've worked really closely with Indigenous groups in the United States and kind of contextualized this talk with the reparation policymaking happening in the US and Canada with relation to boarding schools and repatriation of artifacts and human remains, and how it's taken over a century since initial genocide happened and, you know, boarding schools were completed in the late 19th, early 20th century for these policies to penetrate those political systems. Do you have hope that with the transition and to, I guess, more favorability to reparation policymaking in the North American space to penetrate Guatemalan policymaking?
Let me go back to the first one. Yes, the role of the international community and potentially of the regional courts. In fact, a very important role, I would say. So the Inter-American Court has actually been sort of precedent-setting in defining this idea of comprehensive or integral reparations, and so encompassing all these different measures that I talked about. So on the collective level, on the individual level, symbolic, material, and with different sorts of purposes, from restitution to memory to non-recurrence. And they have, I mean, this has played a role because, and I should mention that probably, the reason why Guatemala in 2003 decided that they would actually implement a national program is because there had been several successful claims before the Inter-American Court. And the claims before the Inter-American Court often run into millions and millions of dollars being paid for an individual case. So there was, for example, one very influential case that was about a family whose young son had been disappeared by the military in response to repression towards a sister who had leftist political views. And the fact that there were multiple of these claims running into millions and millions of dollars made the state decide, well, let's set up maybe a national program, because then the amounts that are being paid are much lower. So there's that consideration as well. And so the international community is often used as a sort of pressure point to ensure a sort of compliance. My colleague Redal is now also looking at the role that the Inter-American Court is trying to play in memory. So they're increasingly also trying to include different kinds of memory initiatives and memorials within reparation orders for these kinds of massive human rights violations. So there's definitely an importance there that the court plays. And at least in the case of Guatemala, victims have been able to use that as a sort of pressure point. I'm not sure if it's always the same in different areas, because of course the court's also disputed. There's, opponents will say, oh, but they're touching upon the sovereignty of our country, all this international interference and so on. So of course it does also cause more polarization to an extent. The second question was about the role of elites, these military, economic and political elites. Unfortunately, the impact is real in the sense that, so my colleague is a human rights lawyer as well, and you can actually see that there's a lot of backlash, a lot of repression against human rights activists, human rights defenders in Guatemala. So it's a situation that needs to be navigated very carefully. It's a situation that is often not very safe. To give you an example, we had an interview for our podcast that we have at our project, with a lawyer who had studied with my colleague in the past, and she was one of the lawyers that represented some of these groups with some of their claims before the state. Afterwards, she went for an interview at the public prosecutor's office, and they said to her, well, I'm not sure if you can work here because, you did this podcast, and yeah, we listened to that podcast, and it was actually quite, you have quite politicized views. So you can see that even doing research in a context like that, or having people talk about these subjects, can have potentially quite far-reaching consequences. In terms of the defining of victimhood, because yes, of course, also members of the elites have in the past been targeted, especially if they were, critical of the state, if they were more left-leaning, for example, if they were found to be dissident. So that means that there are also allies, of course, that are in high places in government, which is very important. For our research, what we did was we asked people to self-identify. So we didn't determine who is or isn't the victim. We didn't determine who of the people we spoke to would have a claim to repair or not. We asked people, do you or any of your relatives identify as direct victims of the conflict? And if that was the case, for this part of the research, they were not included in the survey. And that was, well, sort of a very imperfect way of trying to reach an out group of persons. I think then the next question was about bringing victim narratives into the public sphere, and the fact that can be demobilizing. What we found, and what other research has also shown, that it's very important to combine, let's say, this reality, this awareness of often the structural and historical vastness of harm with feasibility. So to make sure that in doing so, we also put forward feasible ways of repair. And it is extremely important for different justice stakeholders to be able to foreground concrete measures and their concrete impacts. So to concretely show the way that different forms of reparations can navigate different types of harm. And so solution feasibility, as they will call it in social psychology, is a very important component in that. More generally, I agree that this notion of grounding claims in victimhood is potentially problematic, especially in the sense that because victimhood and indigenous identity in Guatemala overlap so strongly, you have this enormous stigmatization and stigmatizing discourse towards indigenous communities and especially indigenous victims. However, this idea, and people will not call themselves victims necessarily, they often call themselves survivors, but for them this notion is very important because they say, we are not just a survivor of the armed conflict, we are a survivor of 3 waves of violence, going from the original colonial violence to the dispossession of our lands, to the internal armed conflict, to what is still happening today, which often has to do with extractivism, so natural resources and lands that they're being dispossessed of because, you know, the state is building dams and other sort of infrastructure and then not even giving the benefits of that back. So it's very hard to avoid, I would say, the discourse of survivorhood and victimhood because it is so integral to the stories of these communities and to the way that they position themselves in Guatemalan society. So it is almost impossible, I would say, to escape, but, and that was important, I didn't show those quotes, but you had quite some respondents as well who said, well, is this really, you know, are these things consequences of violence and thus connected to victimhood, or are they just connected to regional underdevelopment? And then so increasingly there's also a development narrative being leveraged. And you can see that survivors themselves also do this because sometimes they lose faith in, you know, the transitional justice paradigm and the transitional justice scripts. And so sometimes they will rather leverage development. And instead of, you know, pointing towards victimhood, they will more point to, well, the government has a responsibility for the development of rural areas. And so you could see that some of the respondents in our survey would also sort of more focus on that, sort of general state obligation for the positive realization of rights, rather than connect it back to the conflict. That also has potential negative consequences because reparations often have the goal of explicitly acknowledging a harm and a victimization. So disconnecting repair from victimhood can also have negative effects. So yeah, there's no clear answer. There's sort of a very intricate discussion there. Temporality. Thank you for the person who brought up that question. I think temporality plays a huge role. I think it was over there. Temporality plays a huge role, not just in Guatemala, also in contexts like Peru. You can actually see that the state tries to use delay as a tactic in order to not give justice, because they know that survivors are, I mean, many of the people who faced the original violence also in that Kokok community are actually, they're dying, they're old, they're dying, and some of the history and the claims are dying with them. And that's a tactic that the state uses. Delay. And unfortunately, also the court cases before the Inter-American Court, it can take 10 years before a claim goes from the commission to actually going to the courts. And so temporality plays a very negative role in the sense that opponents will leverage time in order not to have to comply. And on the other hand, temporality plays a role in the sense that transitional justice scholars have stepped away from this idea of like, ooh, a clean break, like as if transitional justice mechanisms can sort of initiate this effective and fast transition from violence to peace. And they now acknowledge that it's a very long process and that it often goes sort of breakthroughs and setbacks. And that's what you see in Guatemala, constant important breakthroughs and then setbacks happen. My colleague developed a notion of what she calls participation fatigue, and it means that survivors keep going. They keep going on. They keep going on with different kinds of justice processes, but they are also fundamentally tired. And they often despair because not much comes back. So these long temporalities, they have opportunities in terms of, new opportunity structures might open at political level, but it's also incredibly tiring and disheartening for people who have not seen any change to their lives in 30 years since the massacre in their community happened. So yeah, it's a very double story.
Any more questions? Okay, so we have one question there and one question there.
Hello, my name is Patrick Monkoe. I'm LSE Fellow at the European Institute. I know this question, my question perhaps is more or less reflective. It's about the colonial past, the slavery, etc. The acknowledgement that these injustices happen, okay, is there. It's all clean, it's documented, and so on. But how do you go about the business of quantifying them for reparations to take place? Because you see, this is more or less what people are also talking about now. This is about the quantification. How do you go about it? I mean, that's a very, well, perhaps this could be a question for another time, but I think it's also relevant to reflect on it. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Rishwan. So you said that in Guatemala they have a low trust in the state. So how would the victims, like what strategies would you use? Where was it again? Oh yeah, what would you implement so that the people who are victimized, they feel that they have more trust in the government, but also so that they don't feel alienated from the rest of the population? Thanks.
Because I'm aware of the time, I'll just squeeze a little one here. And that is, you mentioned in your talk that it's, looking at, basically looking at predictors of attitudes, right? And then how people react to the narratives. But you said that people are, you find people are actually difficult to move, right? Their views. But, we want, if you have these discourses of denial, and the whole point is that people move, right, their views, or you unsettle them, or you introduce some sort of dissonance, cognitive dissonance. So I was just wondering whether you have any to address those more. Patrick's question was about.
So, in terms of documentation and quantification, on the one hand, you can see that many truth commissions around the world, including the Guatemalan one, have actually done a quite remarkable feat of documenting the harm or quantifying the harm. Often doing that through tens of thousands of testimonies and statement taking with victims, and then trying to discern patterns of violence there, of course. When it comes to the quantification of repair, it's incredibly difficult business. You have to imagine that the reparation measures in Guatemala, for example, states that for a family member that is killed, you get a few hundreds or thousands of dollars, which means putting a value on a human life. This is incredibly contested, not just in Guatemala, but more broadly. And even, you see a certain divide there, even within communities themselves, because there are some indigenous survivors who say that accepting money, a value of money in return for having, your relative killed is something that is unacceptable within their belief and worldview. And also some of the respondents, you might remember that they said, like, you can't repair a human life, you can't compensate for it. For other people, they do feel like this is one of the only ways to improve their livelihoods. If you're struggling to put table on the food, receiving a measure of compensation that might have some impact in improving the life of your family, for example, can be incredibly important. In terms of quantification, there's more and more tendency to look at these collective forms of repair, right? And instead of giving this individual amount of money, which is often, ridiculous in consideration of what these people experienced, is looking more at development projects, for example. example, and development at the level of the community, which I think is probably also the only way that, well, maybe not the only, but an important way for looking at repair for colonial harm. What does it mean for communities in terms of development, memory, and so on, because individual monetary compensation is so difficult to establish. In terms of trust in the state, well, it's an interesting question because it's actually believed that reparations are supposed to, in fact, restore trust in the state. They're seen as a way of restoring the social contract between citizens and the government, as showing that, yes, the state is accountable to and has a duty to protect and remedy. So the fact that these reparations are not forthcoming, of course, doing the opposite is perpetuating actually distrust. There's also a sense that reparations, and especially support for reparations, it precisely signals the fact that other groups in society feel that it is necessary to commit resources, state resources, public resources, into these communities. And it's not just a way of restoring vertical trust, but also horizontal trust. But there again, you can also see that for some people, giving money to one group and not another is divisive. So there is no clear pathway, I would say, in this sense, and especially not in the Guatemalan context, of how reparations and trust function. But on a theoretical level, at least, it's thought that the implementation of justice mechanisms should, in fact, restore the social contract in a way. When it doesn't, so when you initiate these mechanisms and you do not come through or you do not implement, well, then they exacerbate and have a potentially even worse effect in terms of further challenging civic trust. And that's something you could clearly see in the survey. People said, well, the peace agreements have not been fulfilled after 30 years. What can we expect from these governments? They are corrupt, they are unjust, and so on. So there's this potential for raising expectations by installing certain justice mechanisms, and then when they're not actually properly implemented, they exacerbate harmful tendencies. And then I think in terms of the last question about the predictor, trying to predict attitudes and how difficult it is to move people, I think this survey or this experiment clearly showed that it's impossible to move people with sort of short primes, with one-off interventions, and the massive importance of doing this at a structural level, meaning education. How are people in high schools and in universities in Guatemala thought about the conflict? Like what is and isn't on the curriculum? And that extends to so many more contexts. What about memory? How is memory visible in the public space? What kind of physic markers like memorials and other items are there or are there not in the public sphere? And what you can often see is actually the reverse. The kind of monuments that are there are like a glorification of the violence of the state. So it means at a very sort of structural level, looking at how do we educate, how do we memorialize? And that's difficult, of course, if the political elites in your country are opposed, and it shows how important civil society and bottom-up movement is in making this happen. And I think it signals the fact that what the community asked us is, can you support us in well, not necessarily monetarily, but like, can you support us in designing and coming up with an idea for a museum for memory for our community? So I think that goes to how can we shift these opinions on a larger scale.
Okay, our time is up. Thank you so much for follow our programs in the Beyond Eurocentrism series of events. Hopefully see you next time at one of our events as well. And just a little housekeeping question on leaving. Can you please take all your glasses and plate?